Hi everybody. A good friend of mine thought that there would be people who would be interested in how I built my staircase, and so he suggested that I make a video of how I built it, and so that's what I'll do. This is my internal staircase, and it's a simple staircase from the standpoint that it's just one straight flight. There's no landings, there's no curves. So from that standpoint it's simple. But the way it's built is maybe different than most. And so that's what I'll do, is describe how I built it. Now I'm not going to spend much time on staircase design in general because there's plenty of staircase calculators. The only thing that might not be obvious is that you should get as close to as you can to the rule of 25, which says that 2 times the riser height, which is this height, plus 1 tread length should be as close to 25 inches as you can get it. So some things you can vary, like you usually can't vary the height, the total rise, because you're putting a staircase in between one floor and the next. But sometimes you can vary the run. You can make it run out further or less. And I wanted the staircase to be not as steep as if it had ended right on that beam. So what I did to give me a little more run was to cut into the floor up here enough to put 2 more treads in, and then I used this loft beam as the second tread, which gives it a kind of a unique character. But that just makes my staircase different than others. The fact that it's just a straight flight means that you could design a staircase like this yourself. Now, as far as the design of the staircase, what I wanted, of course, is a log staircase with treads being sections of logs, and I wanted to use a log stringer. That's the log that runs up this way that supports all the treads. And I originally designed to use 2 stringers, but one of my criteria was to make the profile of the stairs as skinny as possible, because I have this wood stove in the middle of the room and I want the radiant heat to be able to reach every place as much as it can without obstruction. So by having a skinny profile for the stairs, that heat can reach into the kitchen. So that's the choice I made: log treads on a log stringer. And I happen to have a half of a log that was available for a stringer, so I decided to notch the treads and not the stringer. So this flat surface on the stringer is just flat all the way up. There's no notches in it to accommodate the treads. The notches in the treads are flat, so they're cut away so that the flat plane of that notch mates with the stringer. And then I have 3 bolts that go all the way through the tread and the stringer to fasten them on. So I'll show you the jigs, some of the jigs I used for cutting and making the treads, and then I'll describe how I did it. Now the first step was to get that stringer mounted and installed. And in most cases, if you have a stringer like that, it will rest on the upper floor. But in my case, it's supported by this loft beam right here. And it's slung under the beam, and there are 3 bolts that go, that's these 3 bolts that go through the beam on top and then underneath the stringer, and that's what holds the whole top of the structure up. There's a header right at the top of the stringer, but there's a gap you can see between it. That's not really holding up the stringer. If those bolts would happen to fail, I suppose that would hold it up. Now the bottom is again probably a special case for my circumstance, but my floor is laid on joists that run parallel to the stringer, and the stringer itself lands right between two joists, and they're on 16-inch centers. So there's a joist here, and then 16 inches on either side of that. And what my structural engineer had me do was to put in solid 3-inch blocking between those three spans, that is between this span, and this span, and then tie them together on the bottom with steel strap to the joists, and then the joist had to have blocking in there. And then these two bolts, the front two bolts, go all the way down through the 3-inch blocking, and that 3-inch blocking is 12 inches deep or so. So there, I had to use couplers to couple these bolts on top to the all thread on the underside to tighten it up. But that's what provides the torsional support for the stringer. And obviously you can't build based on my description or advice. You need to get yours engineered to make sure that it's structurally sound. Now the next thing is I'll show you, well, first the stringer itself, as I mentioned, is just flat. It's cut flat, and it's a rough cut. It's got a chainsaw cut with scraping after that, so it's a little lumpy, like everything else in this house. So the next thing is to make these treads and fasten them to the stringer, so I'll start describing that. Now to show you how I actually make one of the treads, I thought I'd come out here on the porch where all the action happened, all the noisy, dirty action. It was easy to clean up out here, so that's where I did the sawing and the planing. To start with, I start with one of these blanks, which is just a slab off of a log. I harvested a whole bunch of these when I first got the property and saved them away, intending to use them for stair treads. And I still have a lot of them to go. I have outside staircases to build, and I'll be using these slabs. But I used these to build the interior staircase, and I'll tell you how I did it. You start out with a slab, and first thing I did is block it up so it didn't roll with using a piece of wood or whatever. And then using a power planer, I have a Bosch 3 1/4 inch planer. You plane roughly 45 degrees this way, then 45 degrees this way, so that they're at right angles, and then 45 degrees this way and 45 degrees this way. You keep planing and checking with a straight edge until you get a flat, smooth surface ready for varnish. I left planer marks in it because I have marks in all my logs, but you can get it as flat as you like. The next thing you do is take a look at your blank and choose one of the two edges to be the nose, the front edge of the tread. That should be the soundest one, the one that doesn't have knots or weakness in it, and should be straight. But when you choose that edge, then you just decide where to cut it. You draw a straight line, cut it at 90 degrees exactly, so you have a nice straight nose. And then I rounded the nose off at a certain radius so they were all the same. And that forms the surfaces that are the only critical ones in the whole staircase. It doesn't really matter how deep the tread is, because it'll go back behind. It's a matter, the critical thing is where exactly is that nose. So the next thing is to cut the notch in the back, and you pretty much center that notch. You know how wide it is because it has to mate the stringer. And to cut that, I made this jig that holds the tread and guides the saw. Now this was mounted in a really sturdy sawhorse, but this part of it is detachable because I needed to use this up above on that beam in order to learn how to cut that notch. So I set this on that beam tread, and these two boards right here, this one and this one, guide the saw. Now this is upside down. It's right side up for the stair tread. If the tread was here, then this would sit on the top of the tread, and this angle between this board and this board are exactly in line with the surface of the stringer. So now to cut one of these, after this is shaped, it gets mounted in this sawhorse. And I don't have that sawhorse, so I'll have to just hold it up here for you to see what I'm talking about. You can see the nose of it is registered right into this angle down at the bottom, and the surface is right against these two boards. Now what you do is you just take a saw, and I use a skill saw for the rough cut and then a straight hand saw for the rest of them. But you cut kerfs so that the saw just touches this board at the same time as touching this board. Then you have a straight line through the log exactly where the depth of the notch needs to be. And I'd cut those every inch or so across, and then you can knock the wood out afterwards. And that gives you the rough notch. So the next step is to cut the thing to length. And so the stringer is not straight because it's a log. It waves a certain amount. So what you have to do is you have a string that tells you where the center of the log is, the stringer, and then you determine how close that is to the center at the point where this particular tread is going to go. And it may be off 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch one way or the other. And so what you do is you decide where the center of the staircase is going to be with respect to your notch and get a center on the tread. Then you can use that to measure for length. And the next thing to do is to saw off the ends to length so they're exact. And then the final thing I do is flip it over and use my planer to plane off this surface, and take a hammer, chisel, and chamfer this curved edge on both sides, just for effect. Then you carry the fabricated tread inside, mount it on the stringer, and I'll show you how that's done inside. Okay, we talked about most of the fabrication of a tread. We talked about roughing out the notch, but it takes some work with different tools, chisels and planes and whatnot to get it to be just right. But that's an iterative process. I had to keep trying them, and if the notch was not deep enough, then cutting the notch deeper, trying it again, cutting it deeper. If I cut it too deep, then I had to shim underneath it, so some of these will have shims under them. But eventually you get the notch so that the tread is just right, and I'll show you how that gets positioned. So at that point the tread is ready for varnish. It's got the surface it needs. So they're ready for varnish, but now they need to be positioned on the stringer. And to do that I use a few jigs, and the first one is for the height. Now one thing that I didn't mention yet, you need to know, is you have to have the staircase designed ahead of time, obviously, and so you need to know exactly where the noses are. And if you know exactly where the top nose is and the bottom, then you divide by the number of tread lengths, and you can calculate the cumulative distance from some known point to each nose, horizontal distance. And what I did is I drew lines on the floor, on my subfloor. I drew lines exactly where those noses were supposed to be, right above them. And then the trick is to align the tread this way, forward and back, until the nose is directly above the line it's supposed to be above. And then for the height control, I had a series of boards, short ones to start with, and they had to get longer as I went. But they built a jig that was just sort of like this. And these boards were marked so that the bottom of this 2x4 is exactly the height of the tread. So when when this jig stands on the floor, the 2x4 is exactly the right height for that tread. And then I clamp it, just a bar clamp, and with another one of these on the other side of the tread, you can see it makes just a table, and you can it'll stand by itself. And what you do is you stand it up like this. So now the tread is exactly the right height. Push it up against the stringer, and then you, this is a little tricky. I had to have a board clamped to the nose so that it stuck out far enough so that I could drop a plumb bob off of that board to see if the plumb bob hit the line that's drawn on the subfloor. And I had to have that on each end of this tread. So typically you'd push it back and find out that the plumb bob didn't quite meet this line on the floor. You'd have to take it back off, and this makes it easy to take it back off. Sometimes I'd leave these attached, sometimes you just unclamp them. But you rework the tread, put it back, and until the plumb bob hits the line exactly, and this tread is still being supported by this jig, so this is still in place, holding up the tread. Now you need to drill the holes exactly with the tread in place and bolt it to the stringer. So for that, it takes another special jig, and I'll show you how that works. Okay, this is my drilling jig, and it's to make the precise holes you need for the bolts in the right position and the right angle. And all it is a box of a sturdy box that has holes in it that are precise. Now I used this jig to make some other holes one time, and they were the hole pattern that you see covered by the tape. And twice, not once but twice, when I had this jig in place, I drilled through the wrong holes. And so in one tread you'll see two plugs plugging up those holes. So to avoid that error again, I put tape over those holes. So the holes I want to drill are here, here, and here, that three-hole pattern. And this jig sits on top of a tread with the nose right in here. The tread is flat here. This is sort of like the sawing jig, and this lines up exactly with the nose of the tread. So I'll show you how this sits on the tread. The tread being held up by the other jig that I just showed you. Now there's an alignment requirement. The stringer is not straight because it's a log, and no log is straight. So there is a center line drawn on the surface of that stringer to start with. It's exact. And that center line is not the center of the stringer, it's the center of the staircase. So that's the center of each tread. So each tread now has a notch in it that's someplace that is to mate the log. And we're not talking about the center of the notch, we're talking about the center of the tread. That's marked on each of these treads lightly right on top, right at this point. And then there's a center mark on this jig right here. So all three of those center lines have to be exact. You have to have the tread lined up back and forth so that its center line matches the center line on the stringer, and then you have to set this jig so the nose is registered the way it's supposed to be, and the center line matches up with the other two center lines. Now that has to all be held tight while you drill. And the way I hold it tight is I use a pair of 1x2s is what I use, clamped together. And I just happen to have a log wall behind my staircase. So if you have one of those, good. If you don't, you'll have to figure something else out. And so I just take this pair of 1x2s and clamp it so that it's snug up against the inside board on this jig at the bottom. And then to snug it up, I bow this pair of 1x2s and stick a shim in there, and that takes up that gap. And then when it tries to straighten, it, well, something gave. We don't need to do it. Oh, I know, it can't sit flat because of the bolt heads that are in there right now. In the real case, it sits flat on the tread. But you can see how by bowing this, putting the shim in there and then letting it go, it snugs it up very tight. And so once it's snugged up, you check your 3 alignment marks again to make sure they're aligned. And then there's a sequence of drilling. And I won't show you the actual drilling operation. You've seen a half-inch drill motor before with an auger. And the way the procedure goes is you drill down through here, and an 18-inch auger is not going to reach all the way through. The chuck will hit this drilling jig, and the hole will only be part way through. So there's a sequence that I go through. You drill that as 18 inches, deep as you can go, pull it out, then take a half-inch all thread and chuck it in another drill and screw it down into that hole you just built. Well, that fastens everything together, holds it all fast. Then you can move to a second hole, drill that one, and then drive another half-inch all thread down into that second hole. Then you go to the third one, you drill it down, pull the auger out. Now you've got 2 all threads sticking up from 2 holes that are lined up with this jig. Now you take the jig apart. You take the, you unclamp it and gingerly lift the jig right up off of those all threads that are sticking out. And you can do that. And you remove the jig. Now what you can do is you can drill the holes all the way through. So you have 2 all threads holding the tread in place, and 1 hole that doesn't have an all thread in. That's the one you drill next. So you take your auger and run that one all the way through. And then you install that 1 bolt. You leave these all threads holding that together, install this bolt, which means first you chisel a little square receiver for the carriage bolt, and if you have the right tools and want to, which I didn't, you could counterbore the head of the carriage bolt a little bit. Mine, I have the whole head sticking up. And the next thing you do is you go underneath the log, underneath the stringer, and you have to chisel or cut somehow a perpendicular surface for the washer. And what I did is I used a big 1.5-inch spade bit, and I'd take a dowel, a half-inch dowel, drive it into that hole so that it's peeking out the bottom, and then I'd stick my spade bit in the center of that dowel and drill up. And it takes a little bit of, I mean, it runs into the side of the log, so it's a little awkward, but if you're careful, you can bore out a 1.5-inch hole centered on this hole for your bolt, and then that will receive a washer and a nut. You drive your carriage bolt down through that hole, put the washer and the nut on, torque it up pretty good. Don't twist things out of alignment, but then you take your other drill, you chuck one of those all threads, run it backwards, extract the all thread, and do the same thing with this other hole. So now you have one bolt and one all thread holding everything solid, and you do the same procedure I just described here and install the second bolt, and then you take your drill and extract that other all thread and install the third bolt, and then you're done. The next thing you do is move on to the next thread and varnish it. I varnished these as I went so that I don't know why, just so they look good. Finally, I'll leave you with a couple of little tips that I learned by doing. One is I discovered by going through the bin of half-inch dowels at Home Depot that they're not all half-inch diameter. Some are a little bigger, some are a little smaller. So I bought a selection of them, of all the diameters I could find, and the dowel that I drove in the hole to anchor the spade bit has to fit snug, and some of the dowels will fall right through and won't work as an anchor, and some of the dowels won't even fit in the hole. But you'll find one that's just snug and just right so that you can drive it down through the hole. It'll anchor the spade bit so that you can drill upwards. And then there's another little trick, and that is you need to cut the bolts to length, because you don't want those bolt ends sticking down underneath your stringer that people can bang their heads on. And it's a lot easier cutting the bolt to length before you install it than it is once it's into the staircase. So the way I did that is, after I counterbored the 1.5-inch hole from the bottom up, using that dowel as the center, when I've got that hole bored, I just make a mark on the top of the dowel as it sticks out the top of the tread, pencil mark. Then you drive that dowel back out of the hole, and from the end of it to the pencil mark is exactly the length you want from the head of the bolt to the washer. So if you add to that length a nut and washer width, you have the exact length of the bolt you need. So what I do is actually spin a washer and a bolt, or a nut on the bolt, and spin it down to where this dowel reached it exactly to the mark, put it in a vise, and cut the bolt off with a hacksaw before I even install the bolt. Then you can take the nut and washer back off, and that smooths out the burrs a little bit, or I filed those burrs off ahead of time. But that way, when you install the bolt, the nut and the end of the bolt are recessed in that counter bore, and it doesn't present a hazard for somebody banging their head. Alright, so that's how I built my staircase, and you can look on my website, paulandellen.com, for more details. I wrote up a big description about all the steps involved in making a tread and installing it on the staircase. So until next time, thanks for watching.